Hi, Diane. I'm going to give you my initial thoughts on your introduction, which may not be fully formed, but it's sort of my reaction from a researcher's perspective on this particular proposal. I It's interesting. I think the last part of your proposal with the literature review and your frameworks and such is actually quite strong. Uh, I think where I am challenged is in your actual problem statement, which really doesn't incorporate your literature review. You say the post-secondary institutes are increasingly asked to contribute beyond mandates of teaching, da, da, da. Now, keep in mind, and this is something I've seen throughout your paper, whenever you make any statement like that, particularly something strong like that, it needs to be followed with probably 3 or 4 references. You cannot have sentences just in isolation. So that whole first paragraph isn't supported, and so you have to be careful. And then you say, despite emerging models such as community engaged in education, anchor instruction, triple helix model. It's too much for the reader at this point. We don't know what those things are. You have to give us a much more gentle introduction to the university, the idea of the impact of university, and based on your literature review, a lighter version, one that the elevator pitch, I suppose, that you would give. It's concise, but it's sort of saying, okay, here are the kind of models that are available, and introduces to the idea that universities can have impacts on their communities. But you say there's a deficiency in the literature concerning the mechanisms, conditions, and consequences of higher education sustained again in local development. I'm not sure that's true given your literature review. Your literature review actually goes into a lot of detail about the impacts of the university. And I actually don't see that your research is looking at the mechanisms of change because you're just asking about it. I don't think it's looking at the conditions, and it sort of looks at the consequences. However, the university just started in 2024. You'll likely collect data in 2026. It's an interesting time period to see the evolution of the impact, and so you might actually consider doing a comparative study of something like Niagara with Ontario Tech, where you have 3 years and then you have something that's at 25 years, and seeing the differences, because we need a reason to do this study based on the literature. What are the gaps in the literature? And when I look at the literature, your very thorough analysis, I don't see you identifying gaps, things that we don't know. You're basically just applying these models to a new university. That's not a reason to do a study, and for the sake of the university doing a needs analysis, that's not a reason either, because that's not a research reason. So we need sound research reasons. What are these models missing? What are they not asking, for example? What are the gaps? And we're going to address those pretty early in the course with Notebook LM. So that's the good news. Because what you need to do is put this research into a Notebook LM and identify, well, what are the gaps here? What are the findings? What are the impacts? And then what are we missing? And you do have an opportunity to start with a new university, relatively new university. However, it is private, so that's an impact that's sort of interesting in itself. But it's not going to be easily compared to public universities. If it's private, it's a money-making adventure, so it may have different goals, right? But what a new university is really focusing inward. I've been part of this. I started with Ontario Tech right when it first began, and we're not even thinking of the community too terribly much. We're thinking about it, but not as much as we are in terms of functioning and just getting the procedures in place and the policies and all those sorts of things. So the cognitive overload is really high in those first few years. So that's going to have a kind of an impact there. So where I'm left struggling here is what are the gaps? So this says this research addresses a gap by investigating if and what kind of impact newly established university. I don't see it's what gap it's addressing. Despite emerging models engaged in construction and literature, yeah, so this really isn't a well-formed gap at all. Research tends to focus on economic impacts, but that's not actually true given your literature review. There is a lot of findings down there that suggest that the research actually is focusing more than on economic impacts. In fact, there's a lot of other impacts. Few studies bridge theory and practice in assessing how universities contribute to equitable, inclusive, and sustained community. Now, the equitable, inclusive may be your angle, but you're not going to be able to assess how this is done, contribute. You can only assess what it contributes. Because let's go down to your research questions. And they're decent research questions, but you say what institutional strategies. So that's not going to be a how question. Is so what have they done, if anything, to engage in the community? That's going to be tricky for you to assess at a university. I guess you're going to have to go to all the deans, and then it's going to be a lot of data gathering. And it's going to be just strategies they're proposing, but nothing that necessarily has been implemented. And then how do community and business owners, officials, and university leaders? Now that's interesting. The leaders are the people that are proposing the strategies, and you're looking at the community. So how do business owners, city officials, universities perceive the impact of Niagara Falls on revitalization of town? I think really you mean the business owners and the city officials uh, on the revitalization. And it's interesting. You talk about equitable and inclusive, but we're really just looking at business and city officials. We're not looking at any sort of community organizations there. So that's kind of a disparity with what you're saying because that's not so inclusive. And then what tensions and contradictions emerge in the pursuit of equitable community? And I'm not sure what you mean by equitable community revitalization. So that question's vague, and I don't know what that means. Um, Other than it's nice to put the word equitable, but I don't. Do you mean EDI? And how are you looking at diversity, inclusion, and accessibility? And is there a measurable impact of now, you don't want to is a yes no question. So is there a measurable economic impact? Now it's interesting. You're looking at you actually say in your introduction that previous researchers looked at economic impact, but we're going to address by looking at something else. And then you have economic impact uh, on Niagara Falls. And that's not a research question. So that is kind of, um, I don't think that's what you're looking at. So what I think you need to do is look at your literature review in detail, put these very rich articles in to Notebook LM, and start to assess the gaps and the process because you're not looking at how here. These are just what. So you're saying what strategies? So you list the strategies. It's not really research, it's just strategies. Asking the community owners how they perceive the impact of again, that's a kind of a vague, well, it will be a semi, it, it, it's a hard question to answer given that it's a new university, so they ever had a chance to have any impact. It's almost better to do an established university. And then the tensions and contradictions with equitable, the tensions and contradictions uh, is not really a question. That's something when you compare one and two and say, well, where do they agree? Where are the and then where are the tensions and contradictions? Um, and that could be brought up by when you first get the strategies, you have those strategies, and then you say, well, here's a strategy. How's that affected you? Well, that hasn't affected us. And again, though, that is a kind of an evaluation study. You need research gaps to be make this a significant study. Otherwise, it's just kind of a project for the university and not something that adds to the literature on the impact of universities and colleges on their environments. So you need to find something new in there that has not been looked at before.